The Raleigh city lights spread out beneath my penthouse window, a diamond carpet for a life I never expected. Just months ago, I was invisible on those same streets, another shadow sleeping in her car. My son, Julian, stood in my foyer, his gaze darting from the marble floors to my face, trying to solve an impossible equation. He had come to beg for help from the mother he'd thrown away, the woman he told the world was losing her mind. He thought he had made me nothing, but he was about to discover what is built from the ashes of betrayal. It's a strength they can never understand. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too, like and subscribe. My name is Eleanor Vance, and for 70 years, I have believed that the foundation of a life is built not on bricks and mortar, but on the quiet accumulation of love and memories, stored safely within the four walls one calls home. My home. A modest but sturdy brick house in Cary, North Carolina, has been the primary library of my existence. Its very air is a unique blend of old paper and leather from the thousands of books I've cataloged in my career, mingled with the faint, sweet perfume of the climbing roses my late husband, Thomas, and I planted by the porch a lifetime ago. The silence within these walls since he'd passed was never an empty one. It was a peaceful quiet, saturated with the echoes of his laughter, the memory of his footsteps on the stairs, and the comfortable weight of a life well lived and fully paid for. This house was my fortress against the unpredictable winds of the world, my sanctuary of solitude, and the only legacy of true value I intended to leave behind. My world, though it had grown smaller and quieter, was anchored by a singular, brilliant star, my 6-year-old granddaughter, Lily. Her presence was a vibrant splash of color in my monochrome routine. Her visits, alongside my son Julian and his wife Chloe, were the punctuation marks in the long, rambling sentences of my week, transforming ordinary Sundays into cherished events. These were days of sacred ritual, when the house would fill with the comforting aroma of a slow-cooked pot roast and the joyful sound of Lily's small feet pattering across the original hardwood floors. Julian, who inherited his father's serious eyes but not his easy, crinkling smile, would inspect the house with a dutiful air, tightening a loose doorknob or pointing out a patch of peeling paint on a window trim with the focused intensity he applied to all things. Chloe, his wife, would follow in his wake, her presence a soft and pleasant hum, always arriving with a store-bought pie and a gentle hand on my arm, asking if I was remembering to take my vitamins. Their concern wrapped around me like a warm, weighted blanket on a cool autumn evening, soothing an ache of loneliness I rarely acknowledged even to myself. It was this carefully cultivated atmosphere of care that set the stage for their life-altering proposal. The conversation began subtly, woven into the fabric of our usual Sunday dinner. Julian had just finished helping me with a rather complicated financial matter concerning Thomas's old pension plan, navigating a labyrinth of paperwork that had left me feeling overwhelmed and incompetent. He had handled it with swift, confident efficiency, presenting me with the resolved documents and a reassuring smile. "See, Mom," he'd said, "you don't have to worry about these things. That's what I'm here for." His success in that small matter had solidified my trust in his judgment, making me feel protected and deeply grateful. A few weeks later, with that feeling of gratitude still fresh, he broached the larger topic. "Mom," he began, his voice laced with that same carefully measured tenderness. "Now that the pension is sorted, Chloe and I have been thinking about the bigger picture. We're worried about you here. This is a big house for one person. What if you fell? What if something happened and no one was here to help?" Chloe reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, her expression a perfect mirror of heartfelt sympathy. "We just want you to be safe. Eleanor, we lie awake at night, thinking about it. We love you." Their words landed on the fertile ground of my recent gratitude and my chronic loneliness, sowing seeds of doubt in the very independence I had so carefully guarded for the past 5 years. They painted a beautiful, idyllic picture, a solution that sounded like the answer to a prayer I hadn't dared to voice. They would sell their own cramped townhouse, a place they'd always complained was too small for a growing family, and move in with me. Julian would finally have the space for a proper home office and would handle all the heavy yard work. Chloe would help with the cooking and redecorate the guest rooms, and the house would once again be filled with the constant, joyful hum of life and laughter. It felt like a gift, a return to a time when my life was not defined by solitude and the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Then came the final, crucial piece of their loving proposition, presented not as a demand, but as a logical, protective measure to make it all official. Mom, and to truly protect your assets, Julian explained, leaning forward with an air of confidentiality, just as he had when explaining the pension forms. It would be best to put the house in my name. It's just a legal formality, a way to shield the property from the government's reach when it comes to state taxes and elder care liabilities down the line. It simplifies everything and ensures there are no complications for you or for us. He mentioned we would use a lawyer, a trusted friend of his, who could handle it all quickly and without fuss. I looked at my son, at the earnest face I had loved since the moment I first held him, and I saw only the reflection of my own deep desire for family, for safety, for an end to the quiet, lonely evenings. The thought of questioning him felt like a betrayal of the very love he was offering so freely. And so, in the warm, dim glow of my dining room, surrounded by the people I trusted most in the world, I agreed to sign away my home. The first 2 months after they moved in felt like a renaissance, a vibrant return to life. The house, which had been sleeping, awoke with a joyful clamor. The rich scent of Chloe's elaborate, spicy cooking mingled with the old book smell I cherished, creating a new, dynamic perfume of domesticity. The sound of Julian's confident hammering as he finally fixed the perpetually creaky back porch steps was a reassuring rhythm against the backdrop of the day. But it was Lily's laughter that became the house's new melody, a sound so pure and effervescent it seemed to polish the very air. I would often find myself simply standing in a doorway, listening to the happy chaos, a profound sense of rightness and gratitude washing over me. I had given them my house, and in return, they had given me back a family, it seemed, for that fleeting, golden period, like a perfectly fair trade. But the harmony of this new life began to fray at the edges, slowly at first, then with an unsettling speed. The shift was subtle, a change in the atmosphere that I felt long before I could logically define it. It began with small acts of territorial claiming, my collection of classic, leather-bound literature on the living room shelves was slowly interspersed with, and then overshadowed by, Chloe's glossy, minimalist design magazines. My evenings, once spent reading in my favorite well-worn armchair, were now subtly redirected upstairs with gentle suggestions that I must be tired and would surely be more comfortable in my room. I began to feel less like the matriarch of the house and more like a long-term tenant, a cherished but slightly inconvenient guest whose lifelong habits needed to be managed. The first concrete piece of evidence that something was wrong appeared in the mail. It was a thick envelope from a high-end real estate appraisal firm, addressed to Julian. I'd picked it up by mistake, and my fingers registered the formal, embossed logo when I handed it to him. He took it quickly, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he mumbled something about refinancing his business loan. I wanted to believe him, but a cold seed of doubt had been planted. Why would a business loan require an appraisal of my home? The home that was now legally his. From that day forward, I became a reluctant spy in my own home, an unwilling eavesdropper on a life that was moving forward on a track I hadn't been informed of. I started noticing things I had previously ignored out of a willful desire to maintain the peace. I saw Chloe taking pictures of the dining room with her phone, her expression not one of sentiment, but of cold, calculating assessment. I saw Julian on the patio, his back to the house, his voice low and urgent on a business call, jotting down figures on a notepad that he quickly pocketed when he saw me watching from the kitchen window. The beautiful picture was starting to pixelate, revealing a distorted image underneath. The first tremor that truly shook the foundation of my trust came on a sweltering August afternoon. I was on my way to the study, Thomas's old sanctuary, to find a particular volume of poetry. The room was the one place that still felt entirely mine, filled with his pipes, his books, his lingering scent. As I reached for the handle, I heard Julian's voice from within. His tone was sharp, clinical, and devoid of the warmth he reserved for me. The deed was officially recorded last week, so the ownership is clean. He was saying to someone on the phone, "We should get a very good reappraisal, especially once the upstairs is cleared out. In this market, after a full gut renovation, we're looking at a huge profit margin." My blood turned to ice water, cleared out, gut renovation, profit margin. These were the words of a developer, not a son. The words didn't fit into the narrative of us living here together, of caring for me in my old age. They belonged to a different story, one in which I was a temporary obstacle. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe so tightly my knuckles turned bone white. The sturdy, familiar house I was standing in suddenly felt like a stage set. And I was an actress who had just forgotten her lines. The final, devastating blow, the one that shattered the set, completely came on a Tuesday night, a week later. I had woken with a thirst, my steps silent on the thick, carpeted runner of the upstairs hallway as I made my way to the kitchen. They were down there, believing me to be asleep, their voices low and intense in the late-night stillness. "She's getting suspicious," Chloe whispered, her voice a nervous, venomous hiss. Today she asked me why I was looking at interior design websites for this address. I told her I was just getting ideas for the guest room. Julian's reply was heavy, impatient, and it struck me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and leaving me gasping in the shadows of the hall. "Then we need to move faster. I'll call Peterson tomorrow and get the power of attorney paperwork started. I've been documenting her little memory lapses for weeks now, forgetting where she put her keys last Tuesday, leaving the stove burner on after making her tea. It won't be hard to build a case that she's no longer competent to manage her own affairs. Power of attorney, the legal term, so clinical and cold, echoed in the silent house, finally and brutally dismantling the last vestiges of the perfect lie they had constructed around me. They weren't just stealing my house. That had already been done. Now, they were systematically stealing my life, my credibility, my memories, and my very identity. Piece by careful, documented piece. I crept back up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with a sudden, chilling clarity. I sat on the edge of my bed in the suffocating darkness, no longer a mother in her own home, but a prisoner of war, silently awaiting the next move from the enemy. The week that followed my discovery was a masterclass in silent theater. I became the finest actress of my generation, performing on the smallest possible stage for the most hostile audience imaginable. I moved through the rooms of my home with a placid smile, a ghost haunting the living, my heart encased in a thick, protective layer of ice. I complimented Chloe on her cooking while her words about my incompetence echoed in my ears. I asked Julian about his day at work, all the while seeing the calculating mind that was meticulously documenting my fabricated decline. Each morning I would wake up with a renewed sense of dread, a cold certainty that the final act of this cruel play was about to begin. And I did not have to wait long. The manufactured crisis came on a Thursday. I had a dental appointment, a routine cleaning marked on my calendar for months. I went to the small ceramic dish by the door where my car keys always resided. They were gone. I checked my purse, my coat pocket, the surface of the hall table, a cold performance of confusion for an audience I knew was watching with predatory stillness. Chloe emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, her face a mask of sweet concern. "Looking for something?" "Eleanor," she asked, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Julian appeared in the doorway of the study, his expression serious and troubled. I allowed a note of believable frustration to enter my voice, playing my part to perfection. My car keys? I know I left them right here. Julian and Chloe exchanged a long, meaningful look. A piece of silent choreography so perfectly executed, it was almost beautiful. Mom, Julian said, his tone gentle and patronizing. Are you sure you were a little distracted yesterday? Maybe you put them somewhere else. For 20 minutes. They watched as I searched, their concern mounting with every passing moment. Finally. Chloe let out a small gasp of discovery. Oh, goodness. Here they are, she exclaimed, pulling them from inside the ceramic sugar bowl on the kitchen counter. Silly me. I must have moved them while I was cleaning. Or maybe, well, anyway, you'll be late for your appointment. The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. That evening, they sat me down in my own living room, on the sofa where Thomas and I had spent countless evenings. They positioned themselves on opposing chairs, a two-person tribunal ready to deliver a verdict that had been decided long ago. Julian cleared his throat. Mom, we need to talk. The key incident this morning, it was the last straw for us. We are deeply worried about your safety, about your memory. He spoke of the stove burner I had supposedly left on, a fiction he had invented weeks ago. He listed other small moments of confusion, each one a carefully crafted lie designed to build their case. We cannot, in good conscience, allow you to continue living this way, he concluded, his voice resonating with false gravity. We found a wonderful place for you, Chloe chimed in, her voice bright and cheerful, as if she were announcing a surprise vacation. It's called Silver Maples Senior Living. It's more like a resort. Really? They have a pool, art classes, gourmet meals? She slid a glossy brochure across the coffee table towards me. Its cover depicted smiling. Silver-haired seniors engaged in a game of bridge, an image so far removed from the cold, calculated cruelty of this moment that I felt a dizzying sense of detachment. I looked from my son's hard, determined face to my daughter-in-law's saccharine smile. For the first time, I pushed back, my voice quiet but firm. I am not going to any resort. My mind is perfectly fine, and this is my home. The change was instantaneous. The masks didn't just slip, they shattered. Julian's face hardened, the loving concern vanishing to reveal a cold, impatient anger. This isn't a negotiation. Mom, he said, his voice losing its gentle edge. We have already put down a deposit. We are your family, and we are doing what is best for you, whether you can see it right now or not. A car will be here to pick you up on Saturday morning. It was a declaration of war. I knew then that to argue further, to raise my voice, would be to hand them the very weapon they sought to use against me, the image of a confused, hysterical old woman. My silence, I decided in that moment, would be my first act of defiance. I simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion of apparent surrender, and retreated to my room. And that night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the bed I had shared with Thomas, listening to the house breathe around me, memorizing the creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the refrigerator. These were the sounds of my life, a life that was being systematically erased. With a profound and chilling clarity, I rose in the pre-dawn darkness and packed a single canvas tote bag. It was not a panicked packing, but a deliberate selection of tools for survival. I took the framed picture of Thomas and Lily for morale. I took my passport for identification, my checkbook as a fragile link to my financial identity, and the three oldest, most beloved books from my collection for sanity. I dressed in layers, preparing for a journey to an unknown destination. The sound of the locksmith arriving at precisely 7 a.m. was the starting gun. I heard the whir of his drill, the metallic click of the old lock being removed, and the final, definitive thud of the new one settling into place. I walked down the stairs, my small bag in hand. The front door was already chained. Julian opened it just wide enough for his face to appear in the gap, his eyes cold and devoid of any emotion. The car from Silver Maples will be here at 10, he said, his voice flat. Their attendants will help you with your things. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Through the gap, I could see Chloe in the kitchen, calmly making coffee as if it were just another Friday morning. I didn't plead. I didn't cry. I simply looked at him, turned my back on the home that was no longer mine, and walked down the familiar porch steps for the last time. I got into my 10-year-old sedan, started the engine, pulled away from the curb without a backward glance, and drove until the reflection of my house in the rearview mirror vanished completely. The first 24 hours were a study in disorientation. Driving without a destination was profoundly unsettling, a metaphor for my sudden, anchorless existence. I ended up in a public park, watching other people's lives unfold, feeling as though I were separated from them by a thick wall of glass. That night, I parked in the far corner of a 24-hour grocery store lot, reclining the driver's seat as far as it would go. Sleep was impossible. The familiar scent of my own car became foreign and claustrophobic. The steering wheel an unforgiving pillow, and the cold of the Carolina night seeped through the glass, chilling me to the bone. I quickly learned that being homeless was a full-time job that paid only in shame. My savings were in a bank I could no longer easily access without a permanent address and consistent identification. A cruel irony of a system built for the settled. All that mattered was the dwindling cash in my wallet. My days became a carefully structured routine. The public library, once my professional sanctuary, became my daytime shelter. I would sit for hours, absorbing the warmth and quiet, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes I imagined were judging my unwashed hair and the weary lines on my face. The world had rendered me invisible. It was at the library, on my 10th day of this new life, that I met Sarah. I was struggling with the public computer's 30-minute time limit, trying to research local shelters. If you log out 2 minutes before the time is up, you can log right back in, and the timer resets. A quiet voice said beside me. I turned to see a woman perhaps 10 years younger than me, her face etched with hardship but her eyes holding a sharp. Knowing intelligence, she wasn't offering pity, just a piece of practical, hard-won information. Sarah became my unlikely mentor. She taught me which rest stops were safest, how to join a cheap 24-hour gym for a reliable hot shower, and how to make a single cup of coffee last for 2 hours in a warm diner. She was a woman of immense dignity, stripped of everything but her own resilience, and in her quiet company. I felt a flicker of my own fading strength return. But resilience doesn't pay for gasoline. One evening, as a cold rain lashed against my windshield, a profound wave of despair washed over me. I pulled the small framed photo from my bag and looked at the smiling faces of Thomas and Lily. My past and my future. I had lost the home my husband had worked his entire life to secure. The helplessness was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It was in that moment of utter darkness, seeking distraction, that I returned to the library the next day and picked up a business journal from the magazine rack. As I idly flipped through the pages, an article about Raleigh's commercial real estate boom caught my eye. It featured a photograph of a gleaming new skyscraper, and something in its sharp, ambitious lines struck a chord deep in my memory. The memory was of my older brother, Arthur Vance. We hadn't been close for decades, separated not by a quarrel, but by the slow, relentless drift of divergent lives. He was the one who had left our small hometown with a fierce ambition, obsessed with building an empire of steel and glass just like the one in the photograph. He was a man of calculated risks, a world away from my quiet life of books. I hadn't spoken to him since Thomas's funeral, and even then, our conversation was brief, but I remembered his eyes, the same sharp, analytical eyes as our father's, eyes that missed nothing. He was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but he was the only card I had left to play. The next morning, I drove to the bank and withdrew the last few $100s from my savings account. I filled the tank of my sedan, bought a map, and with a heart that was a fragile mix of terror and a strange, newfound resolve, I pointed the car east toward Raleigh. The journey was not one of hope. Not yet. It was an act of sheer, desperate will. A flight from a slow death in a parking lot towards a future that was utterly and terrifyingly unknown. As the distant skyline of the city began to rise from the flat landscape, I felt no sense of relief, only the imposing presence of a final, monumental challenge. I was no longer a victim hiding in the shadows. I was a survivor on a mission, with nothing left to lose. The city of Raleigh did not welcome me. It presented itself as a fortress of glass and steel, indifferent to the small, anonymous sedan navigating its sprawling arteries. Each towering building was a monument to a world I had never belonged to, a world of commerce and power that my brother, Arthur, had conquered. I felt a profound sense of insignificance, a weary traveler arriving at the gates of an empire with nothing to declare but my own ruin. My first stop, naturally, was the one place that felt like neutral ground, the public library. It was there, amidst the comfort and quiet, that I used a public computer to find the address for Vance Properties. The search result corresponded to the tallest, most imposing skyscraper I had just passed, a gleaming needle of dark glass that seemed to pierce the very clouds. For a full hour, I sat in my car across the street, staring up at that monument, gathering the tattered remnants of my courage. I was acutely aware of my own appearance, the same clothes I had worn for 3 days, my hair unkempt, a deep, indelible weariness etched into my face. I was no longer Eleanor Vance. Respected librarian, I was a vagrant, about to wash up on the pristine shores of corporate success. The walk from my car, across the wide granite plaza, and through the revolving glass doors was the longest of my life. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth, all polished marble and hushed efficiency. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly sculpted expression of polite disinterest, looked through me as if I were a smudge on the glass. Her professional smile tightened when I stated my purpose. "I am here to see Arthur Vance." She asked if I had an appointment, her tone implying the absurdity of the question. I did not. "Mr. Vance has no one by that name on his schedule. I can take a message." This was the final barrier. I leaned forward, my voice low but carrying a weight of authority that surprised even myself. "Please tell Mr. Vance that his sister, Eleanor, is in his lobby and requires a moment of his time." The word sister was the key. A word of such personal significance it could not be dismissed by corporate protocol. Her composure flickered. She picked up her phone, her voice a hushed murmur, and a moment later, she gestured towards the elevator bank with a new, bewildered expression. Arthur's office was on the top floor, a sprawling space with a panoramic view of the city he now dominated. He stood behind a vast, dark wood desk, a figure of intimidating composure, looking exactly as he had at Thomas's funeral, impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of controlled power. He did not recognize me at first. He saw only a disheveled older woman, a problem that had somehow breached his defenses. It was only when I stepped into the light that the mask cracked. Recognition dawned, followed by a wave of pure shock. "Eleanor," he breathed, as I stood there, unable to speak. The shock in his eyes slowly hardened, cooling into something else entirely, a deep, primal, and terrifying anger. He did not rush to comfort me. Arthur was never a man of easy sentiment. He guided me to a leather chair and poured me a glass of water with a steady hand while he listened. I told him everything, my voice a flat, emotionless monotone, reciting the facts of my betrayal. I spoke of the deed, the whispers of incompetence, the changed locks, the 2 weeks spent sleeping in my car, with every word. The cold fury in his eyes intensified. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with his silent rage. In his silence, my own mind drifted back to the reception after Thomas's funeral. I remembered Julian, puffed up with a recent promotion, talking to Arthur near the rose garden. I saw the condescending smirk on my son's face as he looked my brother up and down. "You've certainly done well for yourself." Uncle Arthur, he'd said, his tone implying that Arthur's hard-won success was somehow less legitimate than his own inherited stability. Amazing what one can build with new money these days. The insult was not just about wealth, it was a dismissal of a lifetime of relentless work and ambition. I remembered the brief, chilling flash of ice in Arthur's eyes before his professional mask slid back into place. He had never forgotten. That arrogant little boy, Arthur said, his voice a low growl, pulling me from my reverie. His anger was no longer just for me, it was personal. He thought he was clever, taking a house from a grieving widow. He is about to learn what it means to cross a line with this family. His actions were swift and absolute. He made 2 phone calls, one to his personal lawyer, the other to a property manager. He was my older brother again, the one who had protected me from bullies in the schoolyard, now facing the greatest bully of my life. "You will not spend another night in that car," he stated. "Not as a comfort, but as an order. My people will handle everything." That evening, I found myself in a penthouse apartment in a building he owned. It was a sprawling, empty space with white walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a sterile, lonely silence. I took a long, hot shower, watching the grime and shame of my exile spiral down the drain. But as I stood wrapped in a thick towel, looking at my reflection in the vast mirror, I saw not a rescued woman, but a stranger. My body was clean, but my identity was still lost, and no amount of marble or expensive soap could bring it back. The resurrection had begun. But I knew, with a deep and unsettling certainty, the hardest part was yet to come. The first week in the penthouse was a period of profound dislocation. I would wake in a vast, comfortable bed and for a moment, feel nothing but a deep, aching confusion. This life of sterile luxury did not belong to me, but beneath the confusion, the seeds of Arthur's cold anger began to take root in my own soul. The shock and grief receded, replaced by a slow burning, purposeful rage. I was not just a victim to be pitied. I had been wronged, and I felt a growing need to account for every detail of that violation. The physical transformation was the first step. With a line of credit Arthur established, I walked into a department store with the grim determination of a soldier being issued a new uniform. I bypassed the flashy, trendy sections, seeking out the quiet language of classic, well-made pieces, tailored slacks, silk blouses, a cashmere coat. It was about reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped from me. It was about looking in the mirror and seeing Eleanor Vance again, a woman of substance, not the invisible refugee from the library. I traded my old sedan for a new, reliable luxury car, not for status, but as a quiet assertion that I was no longer trapped. The true turning point came in the wood-paneled office of Arthur's wealth management attorney. He explained that Arthur had established an irrevocable trust in my name, funded with $3 million. The number was so vast it barely registered. What I did understand was the power it represented. The lawyer spoke of annual yields that were triple what I had ever earned as a head librarian, making my own inaccessible savings account a moot point. I walked out of that office not just as a woman with money, but as a woman with a weapon. With my safety secured and my resources established, the professional within me fully reawakened. After all, I had not just been a librarian, I had been the head research librarian at a major university for 20 years. My life's work had been to find facts, follow leads, and construct arguments from disparate pieces of information. The grief that had paralyzed me transformed into a cold, academic fury. Arthur had the penthouse equipped with a state-of-the-art computer, and that desk, overlooking the city, became my battle station. My target was singular Julian Vance. My research skills, honed over decades, had not deserted me. I started with public records, cross-referencing property deeds, tax assessments, and business licenses. A disturbing picture began to emerge of a life lived on a mountain of debt. My house, I realized, was not just a bonus for them, it was their only lifeline. They hadn't just been greedy, they had been desperate. To see what lay beneath the surface, I knew I needed professional help. I asked Arthur for a recommendation, and he provided the name of a private investigator, a woman named Patricia, who specialized in financial fraud. Our meeting was brief. I did not tell her my life story. I presented her with a list of specific, targeted questions. I wanted to know about the contractors he was using. I wanted the status of any building permits filed for my old address. I was not a grieving mother seeking revenge. I was a client directing an investigation. And she responded with brisk, professional respect. That night, I bought a large corkboard and a box of pins. As the first encrypted reports from Patricia began to arrive, I printed documents and pinned them to the board: the property appraisal, the loan applications, the names of unpermitted contractors. I connected them with lines of red string, a web of deceit and desperation. The board became a tangible representation of my son's betrayal. Staring at it, I felt no sorrow. I felt only the cold, clear focus of a researcher who has finally collated all her data and is ready to write her thesis. The resurrection was over. It was time to begin my work. My days settled into a new, disciplined rhythm, a world away from the gentle pace of my former life. I would rise with the sun, the city of Raleigh still shrouded in a soft, gray mist, and my first act would be to stand before the corkboard. It had become the central text of my new existence, a sprawling, intricate map of my son's deceit. My life as a head research librarian had trained me for this, for the patient collation of data, for the quiet thrill of seeing a narrative emerge from scattered facts. I was no longer a victim adrift in the chaos of betrayal. I was an archivist of my own destruction. And with every new document Patricia sent, my power grew. The question was no longer if I could fight back, but how to begin. To do this, I needed an ally on the ground. My mind immediately went to Brenda. My neighbor of 30 years, Brenda was a retired journalist with a healthy skepticism for everything and an uncanny ability to know the neighborhood's business. We had a comfortable friendship built on years of exchanging gardening tips over the back fence. More importantly, I knew she had never been fully charmed by Julian. I needed a pretext to call, a reason that would not arouse suspicion. I found it in a memory of a particular rosebush she had always admired. I dialed her number from a new, untraceable phone Arthur had provided, its surface clean of any identity. Her voice was as sharp and warm as I remembered. I played my part, telling her I was settling into my new assisted living residence and wanted to plant a small garden. Brenda gave me the name of the rose readily. But then there was a pause, a moment of shrewd silence on her end. It all happened so fast. Eleanor, she said, her tone carefully neutral but laden with unspoken questions. One day you were here. The next, Julian was telling everyone you'd had a bit of a turn and needed professional care. It didn't sound like the woman I've known for 30 years. This was the opening I needed. I let out a long, weary sigh, a carefully rehearsed sound of tragic resignation. Oh, well, you know Julian, I said, my voice soft and laced with a feigned confusion. He worries so much. He and Chloe just want what's best for me. I suppose it's an adjustment. I let the sentence hang there, unfinished and heavy with sorrow. Knowing Brenda's journalistic instincts would fill in the blanks, I had planted a seed of doubt. 3 days later, Brenda called back, her voice low and conspiratorial. Eleanor, I don't mean to be a nosy neighbor, but I have to tell you what's going on at your house. They've hired some crew to do the work. And frankly, they look like they've never held a hammer before. Their van is a rusty wreck. They play loud music, and they toss debris right onto the lawn. It just doesn't look professional. This was the thread I needed, and it wasn't a conclusion, but an observation. And for a researcher, an observation is an invitation to dig deeper. After thanking Brenda, I sat at my desk and accessed the City of Cary's public records portal. With a few clicks, I navigated to the database of issued building permits. I typed in my old address, my fingers steady on the keyboard. The result was instantaneous and damning: a single permit for minor cosmetic updates, filed 3 months ago. There was nothing about structural changes, nothing about plumbing or electrical work. Julian was not just cutting corners, he was committing major code violations. The amateurish crew Brenda described was not a choice of taste, but of necessity. The kind of workers who would not ask for permits they knew did not exist. My first offensive move would be precise and untraceable. I took out the burner phone again, using a voice modulator app Arthur's security consultant had installed. I altered my voice to sound like a frail, slightly shaky elderly man. I dialed the city's code enforcement office. I spoke of my fears as a fictional, concerned neighbor, my prose filled with the quavering anxiety of a citizen worried about safety. I mentioned the suspicious work being done at all hours, the debris, and the unsettling feeling that something was not right. I gave them the address and hung up. I had launched the projectile. Now, I simply had to wait for the impact. The wait was short. 2 days later, I drove my new, anonymous car down the familiar streets, my heart a tight knot in my chest. And there it was, a sight more beautiful than any sunset I had seen from my penthouse window. Slapped directly onto the center of my former front door was a large, bright red notice from the city. The words, even from across the street, were stark and absolute: stop work order. A city inspector's truck was parked in the driveway, and I could see two officials talking to a red-faced, gesticulating Julian on the porch. The rusty van was gone. The chaotic noise of construction had been replaced by a tense, damning silence. I did not feel a rush of triumphant joy. Instead, I felt a cold, deep, and immensely satisfying sense of order being restored. With Julian's primary financial plan now frozen in bureaucratic limbo, it was time to begin the second phase of my assault, a psychological campaign designed to dismantle the very story he had used to imprison me. I began by studying my subject's habitat, mapping out his world: the upscale grocery store he and Chloe frequented, the trendy cafe near his engineering firm, the charitable organizations whose galas they attended. He had built a careful facade as a successful, community-minded family man. I intended to introduce a ghost into his machine. My first public appearance was at that gourmet market. I dressed carefully for the role: elegant, but subdued. My expression one of quiet, dignified sorrow. It was there, near the artisanal cheese counter, that I ran into one of Julian's senior colleagues and his wife. They greeted me with surprise. "Eleanor, we heard you'd moved to Silver Maples. Julian told us you were settling in wonderfully." I summoned the performance of a lifetime. I gave them a small, watery smile, feeling the cold calculation behind the mask. This fragility, the very thing Julian tried to weaponize against me, was now my sharpest tool. "Oh, it's a lovely place." "Truly," I said, my voice soft and slightly unsteady. "It's just very quiet. I do miss my garden. But Julian has been so good, taking on the burden of the old house. Bob, he's always been such a thoughtful son, always trying to do what's best." I let my gaze drift away, as if lost in a sad memory, allowing them to fill the silence with their own conclusions. I saw the flicker of confusion and pity in their eyes. The story Julian had told them was now clashing with the reality of the elegant, lonely, but perfectly lucid woman standing before them. I repeated this performance at strategic intervals over the next few weeks. I sat alone at the cafe near his office, the perfect portrait of cultured loneliness. I tended a daytime fundraising luncheon for the library, making a quiet donation and speaking to old acquaintances about the transition. I never spoke a single negative word about my son. In fact, I praised him. And with every word of praise, I hammered another nail into the coffin of his reputation. The whispers reached me through Brenda. "People are talking. Eleanor," she reported, "they're wondering why such a thoughtful son would have his mother in care while he's trying to flip her house for a profit." The story isn't adding up. The cracks were appearing, not just in the walls of my old home, but in the foundation of the life Julian had built. I knew the financial pressure from the stalled renovation was mounting. Now, the social pressure was beginning to build as well. Back in the sterile silence of my penthouse, I would look at the corkboard, which was now covered in not just financial documents, but also names of people and locations. The web was growing more complex, and I was the spider at its center, patiently feeling the vibrations, waiting for my prey to exhaust itself completely. The autumn chill began to creep into the Raleigh air, but in the climate controlled solitude of my penthouse, I felt nothing but the cold, steady burn of my own resolve. 2 months had passed since the stop work order had appeared on my old front door, 2 months in which I had watched, from my remote vantage point, the slow and satisfying decay of my son's carefully constructed world. My sources fed me a steady stream of information that I would dutifully pin to my corkboard each evening. Brenda reported on Julian's increasingly haggard appearance and the hushed, angry arguments she would sometimes overhear between him and Chloe. The real estate sign, which had once stood so proudly on the lawn, was quietly removed, a silent admission of defeat. But it was Patricia, my investigator, who painted the most vivid picture of his desperation. Her reports were a chronicle of a man drowning in his own arrogance. The buyer for the house, she discovered, had an aggressive penalty clause in their contract for every week the renovation was delayed. Julian would owe them $5,000. The city fines for the code violations were accumulating daily. To cover these costs, Julian had taken out a high-interest title loan against his luxury SUV, a vehicle I knew was his proudest possession. He was selling his assets, borrowing against his future, all to keep his sinking ship afloat. I watched the data points accumulate, feeling the detached fascination of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. A collapse was inevitable. The call came on a Thursday evening in early November. I was in my study, reading. When my phone buzzed, it was Julian. I let it ring 4 times, a small, calculated act of control. Before answering, my voice a carefully modulated instrument of calm neutrality. "Hello, Julian." There was a pause, and then a strained, exhausted voice that was almost unrecognizable. "Mom, hi, I'm glad I reached you." He sounded like a stranger, the confident, patronizing tone I knew so well completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, frayed nerves of a man at the end of his rope. He stumbled through a clumsy preamble, asking how I was, telling me he had been thinking about me. The words were hollow, a transparently false attempt to build a bridge back to a relationship he himself had burned. I played along, my responses polite and brief, giving him nothing. I knew he was not calling for reconciliation. He was calling for a bailout. Finally, the true purpose of his call spilled out in a desperate, undignified rush. "Mom, the thing is, the house renovation has hit some unexpected legal snags, and we're a little overextended. I was wondering if you could possibly help us out, financially, just a small loan, until the house sells." The audacity of it was breathtaking. Yet I felt a cold, triumphant wave wash over me. The feeling of a chess master who has just watched her opponent walk directly into a long-anticipated checkmate. But my voice betrayed none of this. I allowed a note of my old maternal concern to soften my tone. "A loan, Julian, I don't know what I can do. You know my income is fixed. How much are you talking about?" His answer was quick, desperate. 50,000, maybe 75, just to get us through this. I let the silence stretch for a moment. "Why don't you come and visit me?" "Julian," I said finally, my voice gentle. "We can talk about it in person. Come by on Saturday afternoon." He agreed immediately, the relief in his voice palpable. He thought he was coming to manipulate a lonely old woman. He had no idea he was walking into the epicenter of his own destruction. On Saturday, I prepared for his arrival not as a mother, but as a general preparing for a final surrender. I chose my outfit with meticulous care, a simple but exquisitely tailored cashmere dress in a deep charcoal gray, complemented by a single strand of pearls. It was the armor of a woman who was serene, untouchable, and in complete control. I did not prepare tea or cakes. I arranged 2 glasses and a pitcher of ice water on the low marble table. The room itself, with its panoramic view of the city, was the only stage dressing I needed. I had taken down the corkboard. The entire web was now stored safely in my mind. At precisely 2 o'clock, the doorman buzzed. When the elevator doors opened, I was standing in the foyer. The man who stepped out was a diminished version of my son. His face was thin and pale, with dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes. He was holding a bouquet of white roses, the same flowers he had brought to his father's funeral. A gesture of faux sincerity so transparent it was almost pitiable. His desperate, rehearsed smile faltered and then died completely as he took in his surroundings. He stopped dead, his mouth falling slightly open. He was expecting a small, sterile room in a retirement facility. What he was seeing was a palace in the sky. His gaze darted from the polished marble floors to the vast, floor-to-ceiling windows, to the abstract painting that cost more than his car. He turned in a slow, disbelieving circle. "Mom," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What is this place? This doesn't look like silver maples." I gave him a calm, placid smile. "It isn't, Julian," I said simply. "Please, come in." He followed me into the living room like a man in a trance. Sinking into the plush white sofa, he placed the roses on the table, a funereal offering on the altar of my new life. He began to talk, a torrent of practiced excuses and self-pity. He spoke of corrupt city inspectors, unreliable contractors, predatory lenders, the sheer bad luck that had befallen him. He painted himself as a victim, a well-intentioned son whose only crime was trying to build a better future. I listened patiently, without interruption, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I let him empty himself of all his lies and justifications until he was finally spent. His desperate monologue ending with the question I had been waiting for. "Mom, please, a loan of $75,000 would solve everything. You're the only person I can turn to." I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before I spoke, my voice quiet but carrying the cold, clear weight of absolute authority. "No, Julian." The word, so simple and final, seemed to stun him. "I will not be giving you a loan." He started to protest, but I raised a hand, and he fell silent. "Your problem," I continued, "is not a lack of $75,000. Your problem is a construction loan of $1.2 million from a private equity firm called Apex Holdings, a loan which, I believe, is now in default." The color drained from his face. The name of his largest and most ruthless creditor was the last thing he expected to hear from my lips. How could you possibly know about that?" he stammered. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze never leaving his. "It has been my business to know everything about you for the past 3 months. Julian, I know about the stop work order. I know about the penalty clause in your buyer's contract. I know about the title loan on your car and the 17 credit cards you have maxed out." I watched the panic in his eyes turn to sheer terror as he began to understand the depth of my knowledge. He was no longer looking at his mother. He was looking at an omniscient being who had seen every one of his sins. And then, I delivered the final, fatal blow with the surgical precision of a business transaction. Creditors like Apex Holdings don't like to hold on to high-risk, defaulted loans. "Julian, it's bad for their portfolio. They often sell such debts at a discount to other firms to cut their losses." I paused, letting him absorb the cold business lesson. "Last month, a newly formed investment company called Northridge Capital approached them. They purchased your entire debt, the loan, the penalties, everything. A single, clean transaction." I watched his face, saw the flicker of confusion, the desperate hope that this was somehow a path to salvation. I extinguished that hope completely. "And I, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, am the sole proprietor of Northridge Capital. So, you see, I can't give you a loan to pay your creditor, because I am your creditor. The white roses on the table seemed to wilt in the ensuing silence. The collapse was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, internal implosion. The last vestiges of arrogance crumbled, leaving only the hollowed-out shell of a man. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a horror so profound it seemed to have stolen the very air from his lungs. He had come here to swindle a confused old woman. He had found, instead, the cold, unforgiving face of the institution that owned his entire existence. The trap had sprung, the web was complete, and the balance of power had not just shifted, it had been annihilated. The silence that followed my revelation was heavier and more profound than any sound. It was the silence of a world fracturing, of a man's entire identity collapsing in upon itself. Julian did not rage or deny. The energy for such emotions had been completely extinguished. He simply sat there, on the edge of the pristine white sofa, and seemed to shrink, to deflate. The arrogant architecture of his manhood crumbling into the fine dust of his own failure. The man who had walked into my home an hour ago was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out stranger with the terrified, uncomprehending eyes of a lost child. He stared at the marble table, at the wilted white roses, as if they were the last familiar objects in a world that had suddenly become alien and hostile. He had been the architect of my destruction, but in his hubris, he had forgotten to check the foundations of his own life. And now they had given way completely. I watched him, not with the pulsing satisfaction of a victor, but with the detached, weary finality of a judge who has heard the final, desperate appeal. The cold, burning rage that had fueled me for months, that had been my constant companion in the darkness, had served its purpose. It had carried me from the depths of despair to this seat of absolute power. But now, looking at the broken man who was my son, I felt the fire within me begin to cool, leaving behind not warmth or pity, but a vast, empty clarity. In that profound clarity, another face appeared in my mind's eye, superimposed over the wreckage of my son, the bright, innocent, trusting face of my granddaughter, Lily, her laughter echoing in a memory from a happier time. I realized then that this was never truly about Julian. He was merely the disease, the poison I had to draw out. The true purpose of this entire battle, from the moment I drove away from my home, had always been to save the future, a future that belonged to her. I thought of what total annihilation would mean. I could send him to prison. And every day for the rest of my life, I would have the satisfaction of knowing he was paying for his crimes. But Lily would pay as well. She would grow up the daughter of a convicted felon, a shadow clinging to her at every school event, every birthday party, every milestone. My victory would become her burden. Or I could bankrupt him publicly, my name forever tied to his in newspaper articles and court records, a sordid family drama for the world to consume. My revenge would become her shame. I understood with a sudden, piercing certainty that to utterly destroy him would be to imprison myself and Lily in the same toxic legacy, the final, greatest act of power. I decided was not to destroy, but to decide the terms of creation, the creation of a new, clean future for the only person who still mattered. I rose from my chair and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling city. When you cast me out, I began, my voice calm and measured, my back still to him. You did not just steal my house. You constructed a fiction. You told the world I was incompetent. You planned to strip me of my autonomy, my dignity, and my name. You committed fraud to secure your loans. You were prepared to let me wither away in an institution, forgotten and silenced, all for the sake of money. These are the facts. Are they not? I turned to face him. He looked up, his face ashen, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the confession I needed. Given these facts, I continued, I have several paths I could take, but I could report your various frauds to the federal authorities, and you would most certainly face prison time. I could initiate civil proceedings that would bankrupt you and Chloe for the rest of your lives. I could foreclose on this debt I now own, seizing every last asset and leaving you with absolutely nothing. These are all within my power. I let the weight of those possibilities settle in the silent room. I saw the flicker of sheer terror in his eyes, the final, desperate plea of a cornered animal. It was then that I presented him with my terms, not as an act of revenge, but as a carefully worded legal settlement. But I am going to offer you a different path. Julian, a choice. This is not for your sake. It is for Lily's. I walked to the desk in the corner and picked up a thick legal document that Arthur's lawyers had prepared, its pages heavy with consequence. I placed it on the table in front of him. These are the terms, I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. First, you will not face criminal charges from me. Second, you and Chloe will liquidate every single asset you own. The proceeds will be used to pay off every creditor you have, starting with the smallest and ending with the largest, which is, of course, me. You will be left with nothing. He stared at the document, his hands trembling. Third, I went on, my voice as cold and hard as the marble table. You will sign this full confession. It details every fraudulent act, from the coercion used to gain the deed, to the falsified loan documents, to the calculated lies about my mental state. I tapped a specific paragraph. You will read this section aloud. Now, he flinched, but picked up the document. His voice was a choked, broken whisper as he read his own transcribed lies back to me. The words that had been designed to erase my identity. It was a final, quiet act of justice, forcing him to taste the poison he had so freely administered. That document, I concluded when he was finished, is my insurance. Should you ever attempt to contact me or interfere in Lily's life in any way, I will release it to the authorities. You will have your freedom, but it will be conditional upon your permanent and complete absence from my world. I pushed a pen across the table. That is the choice. Julian, financial ruin and a quiet, anonymous life or total destruction. Choose. He did not hesitate. With a shaking hand, he signed his name, the scratching of the nib the only sound in the room. He stood up, a ghost of his former self, and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, his back to me. Mom, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm sorry, I did not turn around. I know you are, Julian. I replied softly, staring out at the indifferent skyline. You are sorry you were caught. He opened the door and left, and the quiet. Definitive click of the latch was the final punctuation mark on a chapter of my life I was now determined to close forever. 6 months later. The view from my window was not of a sprawling city, but of a quiet, sun-dappled garden filled with heirloom roses. I had sold the penthouse. It had been a magnificent fortress, a perfect command center for a war that was now over. But it was not a home. Its sterile silence was a constant reminder of a battle I had no desire to memorialize. My new home was a comfortable, single-story house in a quiet, older neighborhood, a house with warm wooden floors, overflowing bookshelves, and a sprawling garden, a house for living in, not for plotting. True to his word, Julian had vanished. Arthur's accountants had overseen the liquidation of his assets, a cold and efficient process that had stripped him and Chloe of everything. The final report stated that after all debts were paid, they were given 2 one-way bus tickets and the first month's rent for a small apartment in a distant, anonymous state. It was not a kindness. It was a transaction. The final severance payment to ensure their complete and permanent removal from our lives. My only concern was for Lily and for her. I had built a new kind of fortress. I had established an ironclad trust fund in her name, so carefully protected that her parents could never touch it. But more than that, I'd worked with my lawyers to secure a legal framework for supervised visitation. I had lost a son, but I refused to lose my granddaughter. Her future would be one of stability and love, a legacy untouched by the darkness of her parents' mistakes. The money Arthur had given me was not a prize to be hoarded. It was a tool, and I had no interest in using it to build a life of idle luxury. The librarian in me, the woman who believed that knowledge and stories were the true bedrock of a civilized world, had a different plan. I established the Eleanor Vance Children's Library Foundation, endowing it with the majority of my new wealth. Its mission was simple: to build and stock new libraries for children in underserved communities across the state. I found a new purpose, not in quiet halls, but in the noisy, joyful chaos of construction sites and community meetings. I spent my days talking with architects, choosing titles with young librarians, and ensuring that every new building was filled with light, color, and possibility. This afternoon, I am sitting in the reading corner of the first of those libraries, a beautiful, sunlit building in a small town that had not had a library in 20 years. The air smells of new books and fresh paint. A small group of children is gathered at my feet, their faces upturned and shining with rapt attention as I read to them from a classic storybook. As I turn the page, I catch my own reflection in the large picture window. I see a woman with silver hair and a face lined with the maps of a long and complicated journey. But there is no trace of the cold fury that once sustained me. No shadow of the broken woman who slept in her car. The face I see is serene. The smile on my lips is genuine. And my eyes are filled not with the ghosts of the past, but with the bright, hopeful faces of the future. I had been given a tragedy, and in the end, I had learned how to turn it into a legacy.